Welcome to Spot Check, the video update series for The Greatest Unreality, a dissertation about Dungeons & Dragons. I'm your host, Nick Miser. I do have one brief announcement before we get started in this week's subject matter, and that's that this will be the last of my videos that's released on a two-tiered schedule. Up until this point, I've been releasing videos to my Kickstarter backers first, and then to the general public second. And that's been great, and it's given me a good opportunity to give those Kickstarter backers a first look and get some initial feedback on the videos. But at this point, where we've gone pretty far into the research process, and in these videos, it's becoming increasingly cumbersome just to have to manage that schedule for me, and I don't think that my Kickstarter backers will really mind all that much if we just condense that down into one research schedule. So that's my brief announcement. The topic I'd like to talk about today is more about my research process than about the actual subject matter. That is, I'm going to be talking more about anthropology and research methods than I am about gaming itself. And what I'd like to talk about is the nature of power relationships in anthropological or ethnographic research. Now, I'll give a little bit of background on that for those of you that aren't familiar with the history of anthropology. So if we look back to the early 20th century, when we have kind of the birth of anthropology as we know it today, one of the leading figures and important people to talk about is Bronislaw Malinowski. He was a Polish anthropologist, most famous for his work in the Trobriand Islands. Now, he is often credited as being the father of ethnographic fieldwork or participant observation. He kind of famously took anthropologists off of the colonial porch and into the village of the people they were studying. And this is great. It brought people in direct contact with the people they were studying and allowed them to experience some of the daily life of those people rather than kind of the distanced approach that had been taken before, where you pull them out of their daily life and study them in some sort of isolated interview conditions. Now, there are some definite problems with Malinowski, and I'm not going to get into his whole personal history, although it's worth looking into. And it's worth pointing out that he kind of discovered participant observation a little bit by accident when he got trapped in the Trobriand Islands by the outbreak of war. Now, but what I'd like to point out in this history that became really important for anthropology is that even though Malinowski is living in the village and being one with the people, so to speak, that's sort of a little bit of a fantasy, and that there were still a lot of problems of sort of imperialism built into anthropology at the time of Malinowski and moving forwards. And one of the best ways that we can see this is by looking at a famous picture of Malinowski. Now, here's Malinowski with some Trobrianders, and he would be the one literally up on a pedestal looking away from the people he's studying. And so you can see some of the difficulty that's built into this picture of the lone ethnographic European man among this sea of brown people, setting himself apart, but still there in among the people. And this became a haunting problem for anthropology for many years following. And the problem that has haunted us is this, that even though anthropology set out to help increase understanding of human diversity and better understand the broad range of what it means to be human, most of that was still being done in a colonial framework. And there are actually numerous instances in the history of anthropology where anthropology was actually helping to further the power divide between Europe and the rest of the world. And so we have to work through this heritage. And one of the things that we talk about in anthropology is how to sort of break down that power divide, and people have tried lots of different things, collaborative approaches, trying to give voice to the people in the study and so forth. And these are all really good things. Clifford Geertz does point out, however, that he calls them attempts to get around the unget-roundable fact that all ethnographical descriptions are homemade. That is, they are the descriptions of the describer, not the described. And so we still find that this is something we struggle with whenever we're trying to represent other people in our research. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. So the traditional ethnographic relationship is that of an anthropologist coming to another group of people and studying them, trying to get into the inside of the thing, but still largely on the outside, and then going back to wherever they came from and representing that experience to other people. Clifford Geertz calls this being there and being here as two sides of anthropological research. And there's a problem in that And gamers can understand that to tell someone's story is to have a certain amount of power over them. This is why the dungeon master doesn't determine the actions of the player characters. And in gaming terms, the traditional anthropological relationship would be that the anthropologist is either the dungeon master or maybe a player character, and everyone else is a bunch of NPCs that they set out to describe. And so there's some obvious problems with that when you're dealing with real human people who are player characters in the real sense of the term, that they are people who have agency and make their own decisions. And so representing them can be a difficult thing to do. This is something I'm not immune to in my own research, of course. I'm describing other people. But some of the things that I've tried to be conscious of in that are those power relationships, and the relationships that I have with the people that I'm writing about and interviewing tend to be more complex than that standard assumption of anthropological research. Now, one of the things that brought this to the front of my mind recently was another YouTuber, Runeslinger, making some comments on my video, and he posted a link to some of his really insightful videos that he's producing not as a member of the academic institution, but as a fellow gamer who's very thoughtful about what they do. And so as an academic, we have different ways that we draw on different sources of data. The people that are part of our ethnographic study, we interview, we cite, and then we interpret what they say. And then if someone is an academic, we cite their academic work. We probably aren't going to actually interview them because they are part of the same group that we are. They're other player characters. And so Runeslinger, with his very insightful comments, kind of teases out the tensions there in that he's not an ethnographic subject. I haven't interviewed him, but neither is he a reporting as an academic in the sense that I could just cite him without any reflection. And so there's this tension there, and it gets more complicated. I recently had an experience at the Popular Culture Association where one of my Kickstarter backers, Edgar Johnson, interviewed me as a research participant in his own study about Dungeons and Dragons. So he's a professor, a backer of my project, and I am one of his research subjects. So the power dimensions get very complicated there, in that he's using my work, I'm using his work, and this all creates kind of a tangled mess, which is actually much more beautiful and wonderful for trying to understand the complexity of human interactions, because it's not dependent on a one-way power dynamic. And the relationships that I've cited here are just a couple examples of all of the different ways that these relationships can play out, and all the different types of knowledge that are built out of that are dependent on the complexity of those relationships. And something I'm really excited about, I think that our rallying cry, or our goal as we're trying to understand things, should be as much as possible not to enforce a PC-NPC or a DMPC sort of dynamic between an academic or someone who's trying to understand something and the thing or people they're trying to understand, but to view those as relationships between PCs, between equals. And maybe that's a metaphor that we can draw from gaming to understand the research that goes into looking at understanding other humans. So something to think about the next time you watch a documentary on Discovery about some undiscovered tribe is to think about the power relationships that went into producing that. Who was paying for the camera crew? How were they living, and what's their relationship with the people that they're filming and talking to? So I think that those are questions worth asking, and questions that I hope that in some ways my research helps to spur on. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you next week.